Constantius, who was bathed in glory for reconquering the province of Britannia, and Galerius, who was forced to walk a mile in front of Diocletian's litter as penance for the defeats he had suffered. To deal with the Western Front first, we must follow Constantius from Milan up to Trier, where he established a capital for his coming campaigns. As I mentioned last week, Constantius was probably involved at the highest level in the previous attempt to retake Britain, and so was acutely aware of what had gone wrong. Two big mistakes appear to have stuck out to him. First, despite the understanding that they needed to pacify the Germans before proceeding, they had not taken this to its logical conclusion. That is, they knocked out all the periphery tribes and established a launching pad from the Rhine Delta, but they had done nothing to directly attack Carausius' Frankish allies in northern Gaul. As long as Carausius controlled both sides of the English Channel, not only would his supply and trade lines remain open, and those trade lines were a part of the key to his legitimacy, but he would also be able to concentrate his defense forces on the eastern approach to Britain, since that would be the only direction an invasion fleet would be able to come from. So Constantius resolved to make his first objective, dislodging the Franks from the Gallic coast. Once they were out of the way, he would be able to deal with the second big mistake, namely, that a single invasion force approaching from a direction the enemy expected was no way to break through a naval blockade. You have to at least be a little sneaky about these things, and so Constantius resolved to be a little more sneaky when it came time to put his own ships in the water. Taken together, these two corrections wound up winning the war for Constantius. The first fatally undermined Carausius' regime, the second completely paralyzed his successor. Right away, that is in late 293 AD, just months after being made Caesar, Constantius launched the first of his attacks in pursuit of Objective 1, neutralize the Franks. The key port on the Gallic coast controlled by the Franks was Boulogne, and so, not beating around the bush, Constantius laid siege to the city in the autumn of 293. The Frankish leaders felt pretty good about their ability to hold out. Constantius was in no position to threaten their access to the sea, and the approach by land was thin and heavily fortified. But Constantius was not here to mess around, and even though no one, probably not even his own men, expected it, the Caesar went right for the jugular and began to threaten the Franks' access to the sea. It's a little hard to describe, but in essence, Constantius had his men build a dam across the harbor, cutting off any possible sea traffic. Though he had no navy to speak of, Constantius was thus able to cut off the Frankish ships from their main port of call and leave the defenders of Boulogne stranded without the possibility of relief. It did not take long for them to recognize that their situation was hopeless and capitulate to Constantius' legions. The capture of Boulogne, while in and of itself a good thing, actually turned out to be a bigger boon to Constantius' chances of winning back Britain than even he could have predicted at the outset. Because the loss of access to the mainland caused by the fall of Boulogne dealt a major blow to Carausius' legitimacy and left him vulnerable to a murder. I haven't been able to find a good answer to the question of what the conspirators thought they were going to accomplish by assassinating Carausius, but in the winter of 293, a cabal led by the British finance minister Electus killed the man who had been their Augustus these last 7 years. With Carausius out of the way, Boulogne remained lost, and the little British Empire was now deprived of its most able general. So, yeah, I'm not sure what they were hoping to accomplish. Sometimes, I guess, power is its own reward. Electus declared himself Augustus, and the noose was pulled a bit tighter. But the now practically inevitable execution of the British regime did not follow right away. The problem seems to have been that in the aftermath of Maximian's defeat, there was no concerted effort to rebuild the navy that had just been annihilated. So in the aftermath of his own victory at Boulogne some 4 years later, Constantius still had no navy. As with the reason for Carausius' assassination, I haven't been able to find a good explanation for why a fleet was not being rebuilt, especially since everyone knew there was going to be a second invasion attempt. But if I had to speculate, I would say that no one really knew when or under what circumstances the next invasion would take place. So why waste time and resources constructing a fleet that might sit idle for years, and in the interim be sitting ducks for Frankish attacks that might see the new ships destroyed before they even had a chance to launch? But I'm just guessing. All we really know is that following the capture of Boulogne and the assassination of Carausius, 2 years would pass before Constantius set sail to retake the island. In the meantime, he seems to have followed the same basic policy as Maximian and Diocletian, and campaigned extensively against the Alemanni in order to ensure that the mainland would be pacified when he headed across the water. And, of course, he continued to campaign against the Franks until they had been brought completely to heel, culminating with the placement of a new pro-Roman king at the head of their confederation. By 295, though, things were all set. Maximian moved up from Milan to watch the Rhine frontier, and Constantius readied his fleets to sail. What's that? Fleets, you say? That's right. Taking advantage of his control of the Gallic coast, Constantius divided up his forces in two, launching them from 2 different ports with 2 different landing spots in mind, so as to divide the enemy and keep them guessing as to where the invasion was headed. Constantius himself launched from Boulogne on his way to Dover, while his Praetorian prefect, Asclepiodotus, launched from the mouth of the Seine River on his way to the Isle of Wight. Just as with Maximian's invasion, supposedly, the short trip to Britain was complicated by bad weather. But with 2 fleets on the water, instead of just 1, the operation was able to keep moving forward, rather than coming to a complete standstill when Constantius' ships were stalled out in the storm. Asclepiodotus' fleet was able to navigate the rough seas and make a landing somewhere near Southampton. Once ashore, the prefect burned his ships, not just to prevent their capture, but also to remind his men that there would be no retreat. Victory or death, that is what the gods had in store for them. Now, Alectus, the self-proclaimed Augustus of Britain, who had been running the island for the last 2 years, was not a tenth of the soldier Carausius had been. Believing Constantius was coming from the southeast, since that is where the previous invasion had come from, Alectus had massed his forces down in Kent to meet what he thought would be a single invading army. When reports suddenly began arriving, detailing an invasion force marching north from Southampton, Alectus panicked and pulled his forces up to block the road to London. But in his haste to get the army moving, they became disorganized and spread out, with the British legions proper divided from the Frankish mercenaries the British regime had been employing since Carausius first established his independence. So the defense force Alectus planted on the road to meet the advancing Romans was not at full strength, nor well organized, nor well led. Asclepiodotus did not have to work very hard to smash them to pieces, and Alectus himself died in the fighting. When the weather cleared up, Constantius landed his forces and began his own march on London. With the news of Alectus's defeat already circulating throughout the island, the arrival of Constantius suddenly had a whole new vibe. The Frankish mercenaries who had not fought and died were now viewed as a far greater threat than Constantius and his legions. The citizens of Britain were shutting up their homes and cities, not because they feared Constantius, but because they feared what the Franks would do now that they were off the leash. And their fear was well placed, as it appears that the Franks took Alectus's defeat as their cue to sack as much of the countryside as they could. Constantius caught up with them before they reached London, though, and in a quick battle, annihilated the marauding Franks. When Constantius set sail, he had every reason to believe that the battle for London would be a hard-fought affair. But now, as he approached the capital, he found himself greeted not as an enemy, but as a beloved hero. This great and mighty Caesar had delivered Britain from the destructive wrath of the Franks. Just like that, the province of Britannia was reabsorbed, more than willingly at this point, into the empire. To celebrate this victory, Constantius began issuing coins with his own face, bearing the legend, Restorer of Eternal Light. Just as Constantius was celebrating his victory in the west, Galerius was beginning his campaign in the east. After spending most of the last 2 years in Egypt, the Caesar had been brought north to Antioch to confer with Diocletian and figure out what to do about the resurgent Sassanids. Diocletian had been watching with alarm as the new Persian king Narses adopted an increasingly hostile posture towards Rome. At first, this new posture manifested itself in relatively harsh western frontier. But lately, Narses had been making troubling alliances with the tribes and petty kingdoms of the borderland. Then, in either 295 or 296, the Persian king moved out of the theatrical and into the martial by invading Armenia, defeating and deposing the pro-Roman king Tiridates in the process. From Armenia, Narses moved his forces south through Osroene and stood poised now on the Syrian border. Diocletian knew that Narses was self-consciously styling himself as the new Shapur, and it was entirely likely that the Persian king was getting ready to invade Syria and sack Antioch, just as Shapur had done. Diocletian was unwilling to wait for the other shoe to drop, and so in mid-296, Galerius marched out at the head of an army to confront the Persians before they decided to cross into Roman territory. The two armies met near Carrhae, the site of Crassus's great defeat some 3 centuries before, and after wasting precious little time on diplomatic niceties, the Romans and Sassanids threw themselves at one another. The result was an unmitigated disaster for Rome. Narses ran his heavy cavalry and archery detachments in perfect tandem, and this Persian 1-2 punch caught the Romans completely flat-footed. After suffering extensive losses, Galerius was able to extract what was left of his army and lead them on a limping march back to Antioch. Legend has it that upon his arrival, Galerius was met outside the city by a furious Diocletian, who made the defeated Caesar walk a mile on foot in front of Diocletian's imperial litter as punishment for his failure. It is likely that this episode is a colorful invention, but there is no doubt that in the aftermath of the defeat, Diocletian made Galerius take full responsibility for the episode. Such was the cost of maintaining the Tetrarchy's stability. Victories would be shared by all 4 men equally, but defeats would be the responsibility of the losing general alone. That being said, in all likelihood, Diocletian's public shaming of Galerius is a later invention. For one thing, no contemporary source mentions the incident, but perhaps more importantly, it would not at all have been in keeping with Diocletian's character. The senior Augustus was careful to cultivate a public image of the imperial college as one of unwavering mutual support and unity of purpose, as was so demonstrated in the aftermath of Maximian's failed British invasion. To humiliate Galerius out in the open like that would not just have poked holes in that public image, but it likely would have done real damage to the actual unity Diocletian was trying to maintain behind the scenes. Eradicating the conditions that led to the rampant civil wars of the crisis years was one of Diocletian's biggest concerns, and I highly doubt that he would have so carelessly undermined all of his efforts by slapping his junior colleague around in public. Honor was a huge part of